p.m. We have returned from recess, and with that, I will give the floor to Cami to begin NACOLE training session number 3.
Thank you so much for having us again. As was mentioned, this is training 3 of 4. And let me go ahead and take a moment to get the presentation up for you. Okay, so you all know me. We're getting to know each other more and more as we go through this process. But I did want to take a moment to allow my co-presenter today to introduce yourself. So I'm going to turn it over to Gia Orlando, who is a longtime practitioner in the realm of civilian oversight and also one of NACOLE's board members. Gia?
Hi there, everyone. As Cami said, my name is Gia Orlando, and I actually have over 30 years of doing community engagement around a lot of different issues, but most recently around oversight. So I'm here to support that part of your training today. I live in Denver, and I worked for 7+ years with the Office of the Independent Monitor. I'm not sure what models you're looking at or what studies you've done, but Denver's definitely an interesting model. And if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer those as well. That's it. You guys can ask me questions as we go through.
Great, thank you, Gia. So as is the practice, I just want to check in and see if you have any questions from our last session where we discussed effective practices in investigations and review of investigations. And also, just a reminder, this is not the last opportunity for questions. After Thursday, we will not cut you off from knowledge or the ability to ask questions, I promise. So, but I do like to kind of open it up with anything that you might have thought of afterwards. So with that, just a little overview of what we're going to be taking on this evening. So we're going to be talking about effective location-based community outreach and engagement with Gia. And then also we're going to dive into recommended reporting practices for civilian oversight agencies. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Gia.
Thanks so much, everybody. Can I just ask for like a 2 or 3 sentence kind of blurb about where you're at in your process so I kind of understand a little bit better what I need to address? You're already an established commission, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, and so you're just doing a review, or go ahead.
I don't know if Jabu wants to, but if not, I can jump in.
I'll let you jump in and I'll fill in the blanks.
All right. So we are an oversight board, but we're moving to more substantially implement the oversight part of our mandate. I think the commission has been around for many years, but it's only recently that we've really moved to kind of embrace the oversight role.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say the future of oversight in Burlington, we don't quite know what it's going to look like. Some people, there's a camp that wants to have a separate board that's not the police commission. So people want to give this power to the police commission. And so we really don't know what that's going to look like moving forward, but we're trying to put ourselves in the best position for however that plays out.
Great. So as we go through this, I'm actually going to get rid of the participant list, so I'm not going to be able to see who raises their hands. If you guys could just ask me questions as we go, that'd be great, so I can see more of you. Yes. All right. So first, I just want to ask, what do you think stakeholder engagement looks like? Who are your stakeholders? What does that mean meetings? Does it mean open forums? Does it mean, zoo parties? Talk to me about what you think community engagement looks like.
I think all stakeholders, I think, involves everyone between leaders of the community to elected officials. I think that kind of involves, I believe that's what involves stakeholders. And And I think community outreach can be anything from, like you said, a Zoom party to, you know, actually getting out on the street and reaching out to these stakeholders and kind of soliciting information from the community.
And would you consider law enforcement part of the stakeholder group in Burlington?
Yes, I would.
Good answer. Ding, 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 ding. They're really important to have on board and to bring along with you as you actually go through all of your processes, right? Whether you're doing a case review, whether you're doing any kind of legislative enhancement, you really want to actually constantly keep your stakeholders engaged. Tammy, can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so you're really looking at community, right? Leaders and organizations, interfaith communities, people and families impacted by law enforcement. That's a really, really strong group of people to always kind of keep in the loop of where you're at and what you're working on. And then you're always going to have advocates and activists that are going to watch you anyway, right? But you don't want to just call people out when there's something going on and you have to be reactive. You want to call people out regularly to educate them about the work that you're doing, so that if something does happen, you're in a position to actually really get good feedback and good advice. So elected officials, law enforcement, and also the media. The media is super important to your cause, because in a lot of ways, if they understand what you do and how you do it, then they're going to be able to actually do the research and do, you know, Freedom of Information Act requests and all kinds of things that will actually be able to tell the story of what you do and why you do it to everybody involved. So you want to make sure that, you know, you're just really open, honest, and transparent with all of these stakeholders on a regular basis. In a lot of communities, their boards and commissions are actually televised, and we do that here in Denver, and it's incredibly effective, right? You know, we make sure that people can actually go back 3 years from now and say, oh, I remember that one. They discussed, you know, officers in schools on that one, right? And they can go back and look at that recording. So yeah, keeping the media, law enforcement, elected officials, and community in the loop all the time is really helpful. Any questions? Cami, you want to go to the next one? Go ahead.
Thanks, Jude. I just at some point, will you be talking about how we would do outreach to these various groups? Like some seem obvious, but others a little more challenging.
Absolutely, and you should just ask me if that, you know, what that looks like if I kind of skip over it.
Okay.
So, you know, stakeholders. Some of the fear of stakeholders is that they can be, you know, some of them can actually be really burdensome to time and energy when you're trying to do the work, and especially when you're a volunteer and don't have staff. So I just want to make sure that you guys understand the upside of making that time and making sure that people are really constantly fed communication, constantly able to come to your meetings, get regular updates, and that, you know, each of you actually has a presence in public at really important things. You know, if oversight is actually, I mean, if stakeholder engagement is done authentically, then you really will have a good, you know, impact on policing, because people will actually understand what you're up against. They will understand what your constraints are. They will understand when you actually have to come down on the side of, you know, something being within policy, when you're not, you know, when it might not be comfortable to do that for a community member or a complainant. So you want that two-way relationship with everybody, especially the ones that are harder to actually bring around. So, you know, there's all kinds of ways to actually talk about those people that are really passionate about the work, but you really want to make sure that you keep them in the loop, and especially keep them in the loop, right? So yeah, think about, so this is where you would ask me questions about what that looks like. So I would say street fairs. I would say you'd always have a presence at, you know, back to school night at the high school, right? Where there's 2,000 families having to come in. You could, again, make your meetings open and even find local television coverage, you know, your local community channel. Open meetings and agendas, old school stuff is always, you know, really important, that people have something in their hands that they can actually study or get ready for. When we do reports, and we had a meeting about the reports we issued, we always had an executive summary to hand people as they came in the door so that they understood what the issues were before, during, and after, and could talk to other people about it. So that was super, super helpful in Denver. And then communication looks like a lot of things. Communication is going to look like social media. Communication is going to look like, you know, regular emails out to everybody to let them know when the next meeting is and what you're going to be discussing and where you're going to be in the community, right? So just constantly feeding them communication. Tammy, you want to do it? Yes, Stephanie.
Yeah, so how would we communicate with the law enforcement? For example, our meetings are open and we do have CCTV that records our meetings. So
Great.
all that's great. But like, you know, I would say I'm the newest person on the commission, so others can correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding is that we don't necessarily do outreach to the police department itself, that is the chief is at our meetings, but are you suggesting we engage with
I think there's all different ways that you can do that. So in Denver and in many other jurisdictions, actually going to roll calls and talking about your work and asking questions about the work of the officers is very common. Doing ride-alongs is another way to actually really engage with law enforcement. And then finally, every time, like, you know, in Denver, we actually move our meetings to the different districts every time. And of course, not during pandemic, but we actually generally physically move from a library in District 1 to a school in District 2. You know, we rotate around the city so that we're much more accessible to people. And while when we're doing all of that good stuff, we actually are also inviting community engagement officers and lieutenants, whoever the commander or the chief wants to send for that. And they get to do a little update on the district, right? Whether it's a current crime trend, or, you know, they've actually brought something down, or they're hearing a lot about, you know, a vacant house on 7th Street, right? They bring all of that kind of stuff, but it allows for the communication not only between us and the law enforcement, but also between the community and law enforcement, which is always good. You know, usually it's homeowners who have, you know, less time at the job that are actually at those kind of meetings for the individual police commanders or other CAG meetings, right? I don't know if you guys have those, but like all of our commanders have regular monthly meetings. And, you know, you go in there and it's like always a 65 and up group. And it's always people that, you know, are looking for ways to deal with crime and the things that they fear in their neighborhoods, but it's not representative of the entire community. So it's really important that the entire community actually gets to do the same thing when they have, you know, an officer at hand that can give them information. So we like to give them that. We also do that for city council. City council, when we're in their district, we invite them to come and welcome everybody as well, right? So it's a good way for them to be engaged in the work. It's a good way for the officers to be engaged in the work. And then the last thing that I would say that kind of doesn't fit here, but I wanted to say it anyway, is we usually have some kind of topic and a presentation on the topic before we start the actual meeting. And that allows for a little bit more directed information to be sent out and also feedback to be brought in. So if you all are having issues around, I don't know, are they traffic lights or, you know, some tickets, you know, traffic ticket lights or whatever they're called, right? Like that would be a place where you would then have the traffic people come and like give a brief presentation and then have the cops talk about how accurate or not accurate they are if it's within the police department, right? Here, it's not within the police department, but it's an example that I've heard of other. They have the green light stuff in Detroit, right? They had a whole series of presentations before they actually instituted the green red light system. Anyway, should probably move on. I don't want to take up way more time.
Yeah, I would just add, I think one of the most important points is that community engagement looks very different depending on the community, the segment of the community that you are actually going out to. You need to meet community where they are. And that's not just physically, that is also mentally. And you have to be aware of particular traumas in that community. And any that particularly surround policing. So it does look different depending on where you go, but it's really important to do your homework before you go into that community.
Absolutely. Do you guys have staff or anybody that supports the commission at this point? Is that one of the things you're considering?
Yes. Stephanie can expand on that.
Please. So this could be something that you actually, help the staff person, or I imagine just one like first, that you probably need more than that, to work out for you, right? All of you know what MailChimp is, where you actually collect everybody's email addresses and then are able to send out email blasts about stuff. That's an incredibly good tool on top of, Facebook and Instagram and other things to kind of keep people informed and get them following you. And when you have staff, they should have a good sense of what communities look like and what the issues are in different communities, or find out if not. I mean, I imagine a lot of you actually know the communities that you come from, and I would imagine that's a pretty diverse group. But yeah, you're always going to want to have go in very authentically and learn from them as much as you teach them. You can go forward, Tammy.
Okay. I think
Sorry to interrupt. I think Milo has her hand raised for a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. These are definitely things that I personally have thought a lot about. I always talking about the need for substantive community engagement. And I really like what you just said about, needing to meet people, like a meeting of minds, right? It's not just physically appearing where people are, but just having a meeting of minds and having an understanding of other people's experiences, which has been difficult at times, unfortunately, for our department. So any tips that you can give with regards to, and I think training's a part of it too. Like there's no historical concept. I'll give you an example. I was recently in a meeting, and a white male police officer said to me that he feels safe when a police car passes his home in the town where he lives. Well, I'm a Black female who grew up in a major metropolitan city where Black and brown people were terrorized by racial profiling. So I'm not at all comfortable when police cars, when I see them. It's a very different feeling that I have. And in trying to do this work, I want Burlington to be a very different place, but we can't seem to get to the meeting of the minds. So any ideas, any resources that can be provided to help stimulate those type of conversations would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I have to say that there's any number of things you can do, and there's a whole slide at the end about kind of proactive fancy stuff that you can attempt. But what I would say right now, knowing about what your kind of charge is with this redevelopment or reimagining thing that you're doing, is it's really important, if you get that staff person, that you're really looking for not only a support administratively, but also somebody that's from the community, that knows how to talk to the community, that knows how to find people in the community, and that has respect for the community, right? I think that's why I continue to do this work. It's so incredibly rewarding for me to actually hear people's stories and be able to let them lead some of the conversations and teach the cops what community impact looks like, right? So we had a program where we really used it to do proactive oversight instead of, reactive oversight. And we set up a kids and cops program, right? And so the kids actually were teaching the cops how they impacted them, how scared they were, everything else. And the cops were actually talking about what do you need from us? And, nobody wants to hear that kids really want to play basketball with cops, but kids really want to play basketball with cops. And so, they were sitting down and talking through stuff. And we saw that as something that was super proactive, that wasn't, we weren't running to the press with it. We weren't letting our kids go without the cops doing a whole day of adolescent development training, right? But it was a proactive way for us to start having those community conversations as all of us at the table, part of community. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
I'll keep bringing up other stuff too.
Thank you.
And then, can I add one more thing, Gia? I'm sorry.
Sorry.
there are also things, you know, Milo, that when you mentioned the, you know, you've got people who can say, oh, I feel perfectly safe when a cop car drives by. And it's not a problem that they feel safe. It's a problem that they don't understand that others do not. And so there are groups like the National Network for Safe Communities who are doing reconciliation work where they're bringing law enforcement and communities together to kind of have those hard, tough discussions. And, you know, it doesn't change everybody's mind, but there are programs out there where you can invite people in who have really developed these great programs to work on those very specific pieces. So just food for thought.
And finally, I would just say, because you made me think of it too, Cami, everybody in our office that did outreach, and most of our board members have been trained in trauma-informed practice, as well as in you know, mental health first aid for juveniles as well as adults, right? We all like did a lot of hand-holding for impacted communities, and you know, on the dot, you know, on the minute community forums when stuff broke out, right, between the community and between the cops and the community. Only a couple weeks ago here, they had a shooting a block and a half from my house. You know, 9 cops got put on administrative leave for putting 20 bullets in one kid, and he was still in his seatbelt in his car. And we've put together a community forum, like within 2 hours, we had people to actually go out and comfort people that were mourning and talk to people about what their options were, what the process looked like, all of that good stuff. So, you know, it really is a commitment to the authenticity of being part of the community as well. Cam, you want to hit it? Thanks.
Yes.
All right, so there's a bunch of approaches to engagement, right? Think of it as politics, right? You have communication with your base, you have communication with the larger general public, you have communication with elected and appointed officials, and you have communication with law enforcement, right? You know, you really want to make sure that when you are communicating with your base, those are the people that are most affected and actually probably most engaged in the work that you're doing. You know, you're fighting for them in some sense in their world, right? And so you really want to make sure that you're meeting them where they're at and that they actually know where to go if they need to file a complaint. If they have questions about any of that stuff, that you're accessible, that there's somebody always responding to emails and phone calls around process, right? When something happens, you don't want people to have to go to internal affairs or to the police department to talk about how traumatic something was that just happened to them. You guys want to make yourself accessible to people. Same with the larger general public. You know, that's where you use your media. That's where you hope that you're getting, you know, your broadcast stuff is going out. That's where you would collect email addresses from every event that everybody goes to and get them into one place so that you can tell them when meetings are happening. You know, if you're passing legislation, the general public has got to be, you know, knowledgeable about all the work that you do. And that only happens through your efforts and efforts of the media, right? Because you're probably working without a lot of budget to be able to do big, innovative kind of campaign stuff. Communication with your elected and appointed leaders is really, it can be really cumbersome because they're so busy, right? So if you get on a schedule with them for once a quarter to let them, you know, to just one of you go to each of them once a quarter, it just helps to keep lines of communication open so that they actually will call you if something happens and say, what do you know about this? Or you can call them and say, hey, you know, can I get on the safety committee, you know, agenda for, you know, next month? And can we talk about such and such an issue, right? So you want to keep those lines of communication open. And then finally, communication with law enforcement might seem really far away right now, but if you actually start inviting them to your gigs and saying hi to them and getting to know some of them personally, you know, out in public, I'm not saying go have a drink with them. I'm saying, like, you know, at safety fairs or at other things, you know, you actually then suddenly have somebody to speak if somebody wants to talk. The other thing that's important that you at least consider or understand the benefits of is mediation, police community mediation. A lot of the lower level complaints that will come in will be one cop, one complainant saying that one cop did something and they were the only two there, and there's no way for you all to actually reconcile whether something happened or didn't happen, right? Whether somebody was rude or not rude. traffic violations bring this on a lot between officers and the public. And so we always had, lots of community mediation going on. As a matter of fact, I think we were averaging like between 48 and 53 every year for the entire time I was there. And that might not seem like a lot, but those are 40 to 50 opportunities every single year to sit people down, to talk to each other and also understand each other's perspective, right? The cop gets to say, well, we're actually trained to do this, right? I apologize if it offended you. We're trained to do this. And the person can say, I was really scared. You sent me into a panic attack and then you were demanding these things. I didn't know how to respond. And so a lot of those things can actually be dealt with mediation. And that's a really healthy thing to consider incorporating into your new model. And it hardly costs anything and everybody gets something from it. Cami, you want to go forward?
Can I just ask a question?
Absolutely.
So with regard to mediation, I've seen some complaints come in that sounds like the right solution to. How do you structure mediation? Is this something that the police department has a budget to pay for?
So I can't speak to you guys' model. Cami probably can, but we brought it in. So usually most cities have some kind of mediation thing that they do either between neighbors and neighbors, right? When people can't resolve it, or between public works and, public works breaking a pipe and the homeowner actually insisting that they're not responsible for paying for it, right? It's like any kind of, reconciliation services. So most cities have something along those lines. Denver actually worked really hard with that the person who had the contract for those services to turn a couple of his mediators into people that actually understood more law enforcement mediation and what the issues are and the points of pressure, like what to never let anybody go down a road, talking, anyway, it's a different kind of mediation, but not substantially different. It's still conflict resolution, right? And so we trained a couple of people just to do that with us, but it went through the city system. And so maybe there's something like that already existing. In other jurisdictions, it's actually an outside 501c3. It's a nonprofit that does that for other people, and they just charge a fee. And you ask them to actually do their research and maybe even try a couple of the mediations and see what they need to train their people to be able to do. Because it's usually more. I don't want to say hostile. It's usually a lot more heated when it's community and cops, right? When cops are involved, people are more triggered. There's a lot more trauma involved in all of it. And so you really want to make sure that people are prepared to actually mediate between community members that feel badly treated and officers who actually feel like they're doing their job. And we're not talking about guns. We're not talking about, we're not talking about anything that really should be a violation or should at least go through the process of being assuming violation until it cannot be proven, or the other way around. Sorry, innocent until proven guilty.
I'll just add a couple of things to that. So first of all, before I go into explanation, so NACOLE has had a couple of webinars with people who are doing mediation in oversight entities, both one is actually from the mediator's perspective and what it takes to do law enforcement mediation. And then there's also a couple of different models. So there are models where they kind of pull on mediation services that the city already has, like Gia talked about, or contract with an outside entity. There are also those oversight entities that have
trained mediators on staff.
Yeah, they have staff who do that. And an example I would use is New Orleans, because they actually brought in trainers to train community members. But let me back up a second, because one of the most important parts of that mediation program is that it was developed in partnership with the law enforcement agency. So everybody had a say in how it was going to be formed. So everybody felt comfortable with how it would be implemented.
And generally it means that those complaints go away if it's mediated. Like it's an agreement that that's kind of the end of the road. Usually you don't come back out of that and say, no, I want you to go forward with the complaint, right?
Right. And it's, I've made a list I'm starting my list for tonight's session. So I'll make sure that I send links to those webinars along with we're going to talk about reports later. So I might as well mention reports right now. The New Orleans Mediation Program actually put out an annual report. And so I'll send some copies of those as well, some of their reports.
I think the last thing that I would bring up about mediation is that we never had lower than an 87% satisfaction on the part of officers. And that was a bad year. And we never had lower than a 70, I want to say 77 or 78% satisfaction with community members. So it was incredibly effective at people talking to each other instead of there being a power dynamic and, you know, anger built on anger. So you want to go to the next slide, Cami? All right. So this is a little bit more of the nitty gritty. So you're talking about strategies, website, email lists, social media, news outlets. You know, without staff, I don't know how you get all of these things done, but I imagine you could get something up for each of them. Email list is like what I was talking about, the MailChimp. Every time, you know, if you all had it, you could all dump your stuff in. Once you have staff, you can have a staff member dump all your contacts in so that you grow that email list. I imagine that, you know, so in Denver, we started out with something like 200 people and we grew that list to like 5,000, right? Everybody always was dumping into the list somebody else that wanted more information on the work that we were doing. We sent them reports. We sent them regular emails for meetings. We sent them updates on, you know, on when cases were being released or when presentations were happening in front of the city council. So that's super important. And of course, I imagine the city has a website that you guys are probably on if you have TV and all that good stuff going on, but you could always enhance it and make it community friendly. That's kind of a hard thing to do for city bureaucracies, but it can be done. Social media, it'd be really great if there was anybody on the board that could take on a social media if you don't have one already. You know, so many people are so connected to many of the things that they do through social media. You know, I'm not a fan of Twitter at all because you have to really respond to it quickly, and you wouldn't want anybody giving you, you know, complaint information over Twitter and then somebody not checking it over the weekend or something, right? So you got to be really careful about it, and you want to do all of the disclaimers saying that you really don't want people to do, you know, to complain or to name people on social media, but they, you know, but please contact us, you know, through this forum or through this site to actually be able to tell us about your interactions with law enforcement. And then finally, news outlets, right? Every time that you got, I don't know if I imagine you're planning on doing some reporting, right? It's one of the things that we're all charged with in oversight at some point. At least one annual report, and news outlets love to cover stuff that has law enforcement involved. So either you know, make those relationships or just do press releases and just try and get to all of the crime reporters in your area and all of the basic news outlets. Questions about that? Sounds like a full-time job, but it really doesn't have to be. All right, you want to go to the next one? So, you know, this might seem obvious to all of you, but open and inviting public meetings means making sure that you're providing food and drinks, childcare, printed materials that people can take notes on, and also talk about what you're talking about. You know, if it's a city council thing, then you're going to give them a blurb about why it's important to them there now. You're going to want to provide public comment, and lots of places do not limit public comments, right? Sometimes if there's 200 people and you know, you want to actually make sure and hear from everybody, then you'll give them, you know, 3 minutes or something. But generally, if public comment is to be had, it really needs to be open, and you know, people need to be ready to respond to them. And then finally, you know, really honestly, providing food and drink is what makes it possible for people to attend, you know, once they pick up the kids from school and, you know, they're already passing up on homework, right? So provide childcare and make sure that there's some kind of food to hold people off if you expect them to show up to your in-person meetings. And then I will just finally say that grace, empathy, and connection is why you were asked to be here and represent your communities. And people who come to public meetings really want to see that part of you, and they want to feel those things and support your network. They're there because they actually do have passion about it. And if you're good to them, they'll be good to you. They'll want to know more. They'll want to bring other people with them. They'll want to talk about your work positively, even if they see flaws in it.
Question. This was about the previous slide. So one question I have is with regard to a website. Maybe Cami, can you suggest some examples for us of other agencies? And the other issue is, I guess I would say independence of the police commission. So some of our stuff is posted on the police department website. And, for a question for me is, should ours be separate? So just thinking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just because I'm advocating for you having good relationships with law enforcement and being able to be in the same room with them, without there being any with you guys being part of the public safety system, right? I think it's really important that you still actually have the work that you have, right? Which offers fair and unbiased, perspective on their work, right? You're here for a reason, and they should, respect you. That they should respect that part of it. Our police department, in many ways, really appreciate and send people to us that they think could benefit from talking to another civilian, right? If they're not able to actually provide information, or the guy at the desk is not really understanding what the DA's criminal view of a case is, and then the administrative case that comes after it, right? There's like all kinds of process that you can actually help people with, and they have to be able to find you and talk to you to do that. So they'll be way more reluctant to come to you if you were a side shoot of the police department. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be listed there too, but you should have your own site, and it should be separate. Most people that actually feel mistreated by an officer doesn't want to actually have to talk to an officer about it.
And I've added to the list, Stephanie, some examples of the websites.
Okay.
Yeah, I will say one of the things, when I go to your website, I do appreciate that it is easy for me to find the policy that kind of enables your work. Because it's amazing how hard that is to find on some websites. But I can also send more information, is always better. The community likes to know who's doing the work for them on their behalf. So I'll definitely find some of small and big and some things in between.
Great. All right, you want to move on, Kimmy? I'm
Sure.
approaching that time. All right. Let's see. I mean, we talked about this a little bit. You want to just be in the community as much as, most of you will be in the community anyway, and you really just want to wear your commission hat when you're out there, and let people know. You should have business cards, and you should, if they can swing some swag, then you should probably have that too, because magnets actually do work for plumbers and electricians on your refrigerator. They might just work for people actually being able to reach you if they need to reach you. For law enforcement, as I said, ride-alongs, roll calls, safety fairs, district advisory committee meetings. We went to all of the promotion, graduation, and memorial service stuff for our department on a regular basis. It showed respect, and it was a lot harder for them to actually demonize us and decide that we were horrible people for overseeing them if we were there supporting them when they needed support, right? We did classes at the academy. We actually brought implicit bias to our Kids and Cops program, and thus it was some of the only implicit bias training that the officers that we trained got. So there, it's just really important that you have an open communication, even if sometimes you have to stick to your thoughts and views on whether something was within policy or not, right? Even when there's going to be a cop here and a union member there that don't agree with you, right? And then again, make sure that you're constantly updating elected and appointed officials. Those should be the first people that you actually put into your MailChimp or other email contacts. What am I trying to say? Contact
Database.
application. I'm sorry, Cami?
It's a database.
Yes, there you go. And I think you can move on unless somebody has a question. We're almost there. We're too fancy. All right. So, like I said, there's reactive, oversight that's always just going case by case and trying to figure out how to mitigate fear and find resolution, right? I don't think Burlington is necessarily a place that I've heard of that actually gets out of control over police incidents, but lots of places are. And if you think it is, then you actually want to have, something fancy ongoing with what you're doing so that you have those relationships built up when something horrible does happen. The citizens know where to find you. They know what you do. And it's not based on a negative, it's based on a positive. So we did a youth program. There's all kinds of media interviews and things that are happening on NPR and things like that you guys can regularly do to let people know who you are and what you do. And more often than not, I have to tell you, you guys are going to be in a situation where you're actually doing the right thing by everybody that's affected by the decisions you make, right? And you have to just tell that story, right? Law enforcement gets cover from you being here. The city gets cover from you being here, right? You were asked to do really, really hard work, but you have to figure out how to tell the story really, really well. And I suggest that you actually find regular ways to do that, whether it's morning shows, whether it's the local rag, whether it's a Latino community rag or an African-American community rag or a mommy's group. You want to just get out there as much as possible to talk about what you do, right? So that when they vote for you, when they reauthorize you, when city council looks at how well the community follows you and you're asking for another staff person, or you just want to make sure that that you're doing as well as you can to actually be proactive. Like I said, you can invite all those people to your meetings and ask everybody to partner in problem solving, with empathy, understanding, and common goals. This is like, you are representative of the people in the community that needs that representation to matter. And the more humble you are and the more committed to the right thing you are, the better you're going to be perceived, even when you make hard decisions. I can't tell you how many times people said, well, we would be at roll calls or ride-alongs and cops would say, well, you guys got somebody in trouble for using a black pen instead of a blue pen, and the court, because the court actually mandates the reports come in. We were like, do you really think we have time to do that? Like, look at who's talking, like who's telling you this, challenge them. That's not what we're here to do, right? And there were more than a few times that officers came to us and they didn't feel like they were being treated fairly on promotions or otherwise, and wanted us to actually look at what was going on, on a policy issue or on a promotion issue, right? So sometimes you actually have to fight for, good culture and fair chances at stuff on behalf of the officers, right? And that might not be in your model now, and it may not ever be in your model, but there will be times when, being unbiased and thorough means not doing, not siding with the complainant. Just fair and simple. That's going to be the case sometimes. Hard decisions. So that's all I've got for right now. I'm happy to answer any questions. I will also be around for a while and answer any questions that Cami wants to throw my way.
Thanks, Gia. Stephanie?
Just something quick. So Gia, it sounds like if you're in Denver, it's a much bigger city than Burlington, which is about 40,000 people.
Yeah.
And, I mean, a lot of what you say is really clearly applicable, but I wonder if there are any differences given the size that you can think of that might be important for us to keep in mind in terms
So
of.
right off the bat, I think resources is probably an issue, right? I mean, we have such a big, we have 7 different districts in the city and county of Berkeley, and the city and county of Denver. And, you know, each of those districts have their special, you know, kind of issues, right? There was this big study that came out that showed like where juveniles were getting arrested most, right? And it was like a Walmart where there were no kids living within miles of it, right? But it was a Walmart where they all ended up going and getting busted for shoplifting, right? On their way to or from going across town. There's always going to be things like that, but I have to tell you that in smaller scale, all of these things are good practice. I mean, you really do want to go out of your way to keep people informed, and whether that's, you know, 10 people that follow you on a regular basis, or whether it's 100 people that follow you on a regular basis, you still have to, you know, figure out what that mechanism is. Is it once a month newsletter? Is it, you know, if you're doing public reporting, you know, is that once a year, or is it, you know, once a quarter, smaller reports, right? I just don't know what that looks like for you, but it will always be important for you to actually figure out how to utilize a lot of these strategies to be able to keep people on board with you and make sure that they understand what it is that you do and what it is that you can't do. I mean, I can't even tell you, if you put complaints into the denvergov.org, our thing comes up first. So we were getting all of the complaints for everything in the city, right? Because we have the algorithm that would pop us to the top. And so we were doing referrals for everything possible, lots of judges that people had issues with. And, you know, Puerto Rico called me for like 2 months trying to figure out how to, and this is actually absolutely true, how they could start oversight there, even though they have people working on oversight there, right? So you'll be able to find the sweet spot when, you know, when people actually are helping you and following you and supporting you in the work that you're doing.
And if you don't mind, I'm going to also add, you know, Gia's absolutely right. That kind of like we've talked about with some other pieces of civilian oversight, it's all very scalable. But one thing that I think might be helpful, because we talked earlier about meeting community where they are, and that means that maybe there aren't members of your board that really have a great understanding of some of a particular community's needs or history. And so there are civilian oversight entities who have developed ambassadorship programs, essentially. Atlanta is a great example. And what they do is they work with community organizational entities, advocacy groups, and they essentially train those members of those advocacy groups on what the oversight entity, what your commission is doing. And then those individuals can go out and be your advocate to the community, to their community. And so they're able to kind of expand your reach exponentially.
Yep.
And also make sure that you're meeting the community where they are and have a better understanding of what they need. So.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Okay, any more questions for Gia before we move on to reporting? Okay, so now the exciting world of recommended reporting practices. We've kind of touched on, you know, when we talked about the principles of oversight, we've talked, reporting practices have come up several times, but they are really important as part of the work of any oversight entity. So they're the primary source of information about the operations and public interactions, not only of you, what you're doing, but also the law enforcement agency. No one else is really putting out reports in a way that you can. It's recommended that reports be at a minimum, and that is a very key word in this, annually. But really, in many instances, it's appropriate to issue them more regularly. And that could be because there's a lot of things going on. It could be that you want to do smaller reports throughout the year. It could be that there was a particular incident that the commission did work on, and you want to make sure that that's a standalone report. So there's lots of reasons to do individual reports other than just an annual. It should be logic. Now some of this is going to seem fairly obvious, but I still want to go over it because I think it's really important so that you are creating these reports for your audience. It should be divided into several sections corresponding to the various activities that you do and that you perform, types of information that you want to report to the public. And like this slide, I guess I should actually show you this slide, sorry. That could include agency's mission, its authority, its activities, its accomplishments. Lengthy reports should be summarized. So if you've got even if it's a 20-page report, there needs to be essentially an executive summary at the front, because you know that there are people who, and I'll admit, I'm occasionally one of them. You are busy people. You want to make sure that you get all the information, but you don't have time to read through all of it. You make sure that everybody's going to at least get a summary and know what the highlights are of that report. And hopefully that's written in a way that they realize the importance of reading the whole report. You really should look at the report as an opportunity to explain in very clear language the processes, procedures, definitions relevant to your work. All of the acronyms that get used, make sure those are all laid out for people. And like how complaints are processed and adjudicated, or how the agency monitors department investigations. You can also add additional information, such as commendations that were given in the law enforcement agency, and a summary of all of your outreach efforts that you've done. So they should know everything that you have done in the last year, unless you're doing them more frequently. I think it's also really important for you to use the reports as an opportunity to report on the recommendations that you have made to the law enforcement agency. It's also very important to follow that up with how those recommendations have been received. Have any of those recommendations been implemented? Have you received any written response to any of those recommendations? Because that is bringing that transparency that we talk about so often to this very opaque process. That way also the community can see the work that you're doing. Also, any data, infographics, describing caseload, complaint allegations, dispositions, officer and complainant demographics, complaint geographies. That helps the public understand what's happening in the world of police misconduct investigations, policy recommendations, police reform. This is really one of the few places where they can go for that information. So the more information, the better. And I think it's also good if you include comparative data, so people can look at it from year to year. I would say that data is often, that it should be made clear that data doesn't necessarily indicate, like if there's a shift when you're doing the comparison, sometimes people say, oh, well, there were 90 complaints this year, but there were only 70 this year. So everything seems to be getting better. Well, there are so many factors in why there are complaints made, or as to what dispositions end up coming out of the complaints that are made, that you can't really say that cases going down or cases going up, or an indication of success, failure, really of anything. A lot of times people say, well, complaints went up either because there's more misconduct, or because we made the complaint process more accessible, or now people are feel more comfortable with the complaint process. So it's really hard to measure. And for those of you who work with data, I think you'll understand that civilian oversight is it's really frustrating when it comes to data and comparisons for the work that you're doing. And then also one more thing on the data, make sure that you include very easy to understand explanations of the data, because not everyone knows police work. Not everyone understands data, and you want to make sure that this is really having an impact, and that means people need to understand what's being put out there. So please keep that in mind as well.
So Cami?
Yeah,
So,
I knew there'd be a question from the data
so
person.
just a request
Yeah.
to add to your list. Maybe you can send us an example of a good annual report that, you know, especially around like easy to understand explanations of the data, but anything, just a couple of models for us to look at.
Absolutely, absolutely. I can do that, and I can send some that I'll also make sure there's some that are very simple and a little more complicated, because that way you can see what different years look like for different agencies. So then let me talk a little bit about special reports. So when an oversight agency performs an in-depth investigation or review of policies and procedures, critical incidents, or anything else that the community has great concern over, the agency's findings should be published in a report separate from the annual report so that it gives the attention that it's due. Special reports can extend the oversight agency's public reach by drawing attention to the agency's responses to specific matters. It really is, it's again, one more way to build legitimacy with the community, because they're seeing the work that you're doing. Otherwise, if that's not out there, you are working kind of in the darkness. So it's really important. Special reports also can build the relations between oversight agency and the public. Also highlighting the recommendations, like if you do, here's a great example. So the New York City office, or NYPD's Office of the Inspector General, several years ago, they did a report on, or a systemic review on use of force reporting practices. And in that report, they found some issues. They also made a slew of recommendations, which were all accepted by NYPD. I believe all of them were. And then they were going to be implemented. They did a follow-up report a couple of years later. So not only could they see if during their examination, were these policies actually implemented, but also very importantly, did they make a difference? So it's also important to kind of do that check on your own work as well. And so make sure that most of the work done in oversight is rarely one and done. There's always some kind of follow-up that needs to happen. Okay, publishing and presenting data. So in addition to the reports, it really is important to make data accessible. Some agencies make this data accessible right on their website. They have dashboards that give them access to everything, or they have a link to a dashboard that may already exist through the police department, because there are some departments who are giving readily accessible information to the public. Now, normally it's very raw data, and if most people look at it, they're like, whoa, what am I looking at? Because there's just so much there. But having that access is really one of the first steps to getting information and transparency. So data on complaints, complainant, alleged victims, and officer demographics are important data to think about. Allegations, dispositions, complaint geographies, and give people visualization of that. You know, let people see it on a map. Let them see the graphs, the bar graphs. Make sure it's easy for them to really understand the data that's been presented to them. A great example, so Portland, Oregon, their independent police review board publishes several years of data on its website at any given time. So it includes complaints, intake decisions, closure reasons, complaint demographics, complaint geographies, and allows members of the public to download the information, the raw data, and includes an appendix describing all of the data sources. So I would also suggest kind of looking, as you're looking at websites, that is one way to kind of address two issues at once. You're getting the data out to people. You're also doing a piece of community outreach by making it easily accessible. Before I move on, any questions yet? Yeah,
I have a question about frequency.
yeah.
So for example, the city just did an analysis of traffic stops, use of force, and arrests. And we received that information as the commission. So what I'm wondering is, when you say to present data regularly, this was an annual report to us. And, you know, again, it's a town of 40,000 people. Do you think those kinds of data reports should be more frequent than annually?
Well,
Or what should be more frequent? What kinds of things would you report more frequently than others?
well, I think that, for instance, the data that was you were talking about that just kind of came out, that information is important to get out sooner rather than later, that it shouldn't wait until your annual report.
Got it.
So, you know, in a city of your size, there's not probably data coming out every month in droves for you to load up onto a website and let people see it. But when you are given access to it, whenever you can do that, so I guess the better word than regular, because that really says, okay, every 45 days, make sure it's up. That more, it's periodic. Like when you have access to it, let the public have it as soon as you're able.
Great.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. So next, a little bit more about public reporting and transparency. So the reporting is another way to allow the public to clearly understand your authority, purpose, procedures, and accomplishments. And in some cases, realize the need to support additional authorities if those exist, or if that need exists. When they can see, when you are giving an honest assessment of the work over the year, there's going to be some questions like, well, but why aren't you doing this? And so these reports also should be followed up with community engagement so that you can present the report and then answer questions about it and continue to lay down those expectations of, well, this is what we've done because this is what we're allowed to do with the authority that we've been given. And then be able to educate on some things that could happen with additional authorities if those are needed. So make sure that those reports are definitely pushed out in a way that the community has a lot of access to it, because you also don't want to have a report that just gets done, because there are agencies, unfortunately, where this happens. They spend all of this time on this beautiful glossy covered report that then just gets stashed and not much else happens to it. So use that to your advantage to create a more transparency. And it's not only to your benefit, it's also to the law enforcement agency's benefit to have that information out there. A community who feels that they know more about what's going on within police are more likely to feel that their work is legitimate. And even if they don't feel the work is legitimate because there's some things out there that need to be fixed, it allows them insight into the process. And then that's where your piece comes in, so that they can see the recommendations that are being made and the work that's being done by the commission. You also should include some information about patterns and trends, both in complaints and in discipline. As I mentioned before, all of the recommendations over the past year, and any issues that have come up that you think that you see as concerns for the public. Don't hide any of those. The more information that you give, the better. At least all that information that is allowed by law. So that is really important. Also, this is, I don't think, a lot of times they say that you should write a report so that a third grader could read it. You should write it in an accessible manner, but it should be written in a way that gives the information accurately and with the tone that it deserves. I mean, it's serious information that's being put out there. And if there are people who don't understand the information, that's also part of that community outreach, so that you can get out there and give that information and help educate the public on some things that they might not totally understand, that's totally forgivable, because this is not a process that has really been in the sunshine for people until recently. So make sure don't make things so simple that you lose the intricacies of the work that's being done. And then I realize I have flown through these slides. I really had anticipated more questions. But here are, I will send you the links to these reports and others. San Jose has, although there are many amazing reports. So San Jose is an agency that's been around. It's an independent police auditor model that's been around since, I believe, maybe 1993. And for the longest time, they still are. It's a gold standard of a report. They give great information. It's very accessible. There's lots of visuals. And so it is, it's a good report to look at. And then the other one is the one that I talked to you about earlier in the NYPD OIG's report. That's a great one as well. One other one, and I promise I'm not saying this just because Gia is on the call and from Denver, but so in the case of Denver, their office of the police monitor, or the independent monitor, excuse me, they put out a report, but their civilian review board also puts out a report, so that the public can see the work that's being done and how it's being done kind of differently, but with the same goal. So I always have found that great, that they have their own reports, so they can present the work from their own perspectives.
Cami, just to give that a little bit more background. So that's actually, it's super important more than anything, because they are charged with evaluating the monitor's office. So that's how that's their charge to make us independent.
And so there are also reports from much smaller agencies. You know, the one-man shop, or the just shop full of volunteers who are doing the best to make this all happen. So I will look for some of those as well, so you can see what those look like when you have maybe a smaller complaint load or a smaller city, so that you can also see that. I will say there are still some civilian oversight agencies out there that don't put out an annual report. And I really feel like they are missing the boat. They really are missing the opportunity to do that outreach and engagement of the work with all of the stakeholders. And then there are some different agencies do it differently, but there are some who give advanced copies of that report, and then so that everybody's aware of what's coming. There are some agencies where not only does the agency release the report with a press release, but then they also give the opportunity to the law enforcement agency to give a response to the report. NYPD is, they always have a response to every report that comes out, regardless of which agency is putting it out. So, so there is those things to consider as well, and kind of to think about how you want that to look when you do start releasing them. Stephanie?
Can you give me an example of what a response would look like? Is it sort of maybe like to contextualize trends and complaints or things like that?
Yes, so it can be to contextualize the trends. It can be to completely refute the findings.
Mhm.
It can be to disagree or agree with the recommendations. So it really kind of depends on how controversial the the content of the report is. But but it is nice, I think, to have everybody being able to have their voice, so that everybody, the public should also know. It's just kind of why I said that the police department should give written response to recommendations that are made, because the public should know what's coming out of the oversight entity, and they should know how law enforcement is responding to it. What I don't believe in is the ability for any stakeholder to have editorial rights to the reports that you're putting out. That's why they get to have their own report. So, any additional questions?
So there are two reports that I really, or two agencies that I really love the way that they do their reporting. And one is Denver, and it took us a long time to kind of get to a place. I'm not plugging Denver, but Nick was an incredible writer and did a lot of really good reporting. And then the other place is actually, I wanted to say Detroit, but it's not Detroit, Cami, but it's up there. Is it? It's not Detroit.
Ann Arbor
Is it Ann Arbor? I think it's Ann Arbor.
or Grand Rapids? I'm not sure which one you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't know which one. Which one has been around?
I'll look and send.
Yeah, and it's only because they actually regularly like talk to the same things. So, you know, a report comes out and then 6 months later, another report comes out, and they're actually like following the trend lines for, you know, 6 reports back. So you can really see where things are going. The other thing is that they pretty often take on specific topics and specific recommendations, but not in full detail, right? So they'll say, while we were doing this, we realized that this was happening to a lot of people, and we're going to take this into advisement for the next report, right? We recommend that, you know, they continue to, you know, fight the urge to not turn on their body-worn camera or whatever it is, right? Like that there's topics that they're bringing up that actually get people's interest and keep the media's interest, right? For later reporting. It feels much more like reading a really good newspaper than, you know, reading an academic report, and you're actually being educated as you go.
Great. Anything else? I don't want to shortchange you on time, but I also don't want to keep you on a Zoom meeting for the sake, particularly since I will see you on Thursday as well.
I do have a question, though it's not in relation to what we've talked about today moving forward. Well, actually, maybe kind of a little bit. So I did see, I mentioned there, like, you know, releasing information as allowed by law. And I find some of the problems we get into is contractually protected information with the BPD. And that's actually, their contract expires next year. So I believe that the renegotiated process it will be occurring sometime soon. We are not a part of that, but I guess how do we go about, I guess, maybe kind of influencing those talks with the people who will be having those negotiations with the union?
Yeah, so
not the easiest question, sorry.
No, it's a good question, but it is a problem that some jurisdictions have, a serious problem. There are some jurisdictions that can't have oversight because it's forbidden within the union contract. So so I think because you are not at the table for those, there are ways that you can at least kind of put out what you are hopeful will be discussed and eventually solidified in the contract. There are some people who I can definitely put you guys in touch with who that is what they do. And some of them are in oversight agencies where that is all they did, because it completely consumed their time while they were at the oversight agency. But we can definitely put you in touch with some people for some conversations about that, to how do you handle it, how to make sure that the needs of civilian oversight, effective, sustainable oversight, are addressed in that process, because that translates directly to the needs for the community as well, and their voice should be part of that process as well.
Thank you. That'd be very much appreciated.
Okay, I'm going to add it to the list. Did you have a question, Shreen?
Yeah, thank you. This is for Gia. Gia, you spoke about, obviously you spoke at great length about trust and building and keeping the trust of the community and transparency. And what I'm trying to figure out is, how does one balance that when the work that we do is largely, well, the oversight work we do, other than the policy work and the directive work, is then we're looking at individual cases and complaints about individuals. And that's an executive session. And I've noticed this year a lot more desire of this commission to speak out publicly on specific cases, which I don't know how you maintain neutrality. I also don't know how you can talk about specific cases, but that's where I get uncomfortable, because I recognize that how are we going to be transparent and trusted if we don't talk about it? But on the other hand, how do you maintain this sense of neutrality when you're publicly talking about cases? So I don't know if you can speak to that.
I can. So, I mean, this actually, Cammie and I both could, because a lot of this comes with the reporting, right? So when you're in the investigative phase, generally you shouldn't and you can't talk about what's going on in a particular case. And then for many jurisdictions, you can't even name anybody after the case unless it's a really famous case, right? An officer involved shooting, in custody death, those generally become kind of infamous and newsworthy, and people get outed anyway, right? But when they can't be, then you can actually talk about process. We do a lot of talking about process. So for critical cases in Denver, there is first, the DA and investigators are part of the criminal investigation, but all of the criminal investigation then gets turned over for an administrative investigation, right? And between those two processes and figuring out what a timeline is and releasing camera footage and all that kind of stuff, I mean, that could be 8 months, right? By the time like an office like ours would even get our hands on those materials. We might be able to look at it, but not really do an in-depth look, especially if we're talking about there being 20 officers at the scene, or, you know what I mean? Like something being huge, it's just gonna be a really long process. So it's really helpful on a regular basis to talk to people about what you know, what the process is, connecting them with other people that can talk to them about process. We forever did not have a progressive DA, but we finally got a DA that was willing to talk to people, not about what was going on in the case, but to say, we're approaching this deadline, we expect to be done by December, kind of thing. And then we'll turn it over for an administrative process, because the more reassuring you can be and the more you can actually talk people through, yes, I know, being patient with them and understanding that it's crazy to think that you're not going to know anything about your kid getting shot until a year later, right? Or about somebody, overdosing in the backseat of a cop car until a year later, because they haven't completed the investigation. So a lot of organizations have actually set up with their police department, they've set up, quicker viewings of body-worn camera footage. Even if it doesn't go public, and at least they explain what's going on with the investigations with the family. And those are the kind of things that you guys can have an impact on, policy-wise. But other than that, just being a resource for access to information as it becomes available and explaining the process, and being of comfort, right? Like, you guys are the only ones that are not a liability in this situation. You didn't shoot anybody, and you don't work for the city that is going to have to pay out if there's a fault, right? If there's risk management stuff. So, we found ourselves actually being incredibly accessible and comforting to a lot of people who really felt like, they should have access to more information than they will. So trust really comes from you guys' activity in that whole thing.
And giving that information proactively, rather than, even if there isn't new information about what's going to happen next, not waiting until you have it, because time lapse seems so much longer when you're waiting for the information than when you're giving the information.
Mhm.
And so if you can, even if you give updates that say, I want to keep you informed, I don't have any updates, but let me just remind you of where we are in the process, and this is what we expect to happen in hopefully X months or X weeks, because then you're not on the defensive where you've got people who are very upset because they haven't heard anything for months.
So I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
That would be an appropriate role for us within the context of a complaint. So the department is doing their investigation. We have now instituted an acknowledgement of every complaint that comes in where there's an identified complainant, just a reach out saying, we've received it and we want you to know it. We're going to give it its, what you deserve on this. We're going to look at it, but it could take a while. And so that's appropriate, and to check back in with that person from time to time if they happen to write us back. I mean, I think that doesn't always happen, right? Folks make a complaint and we might reach out and never hear from them.
And I would also just be, be cognizant of the fact that a lot of people that actually have these interactions are not going to see you differently if you don't act differently, right?
Mhm.
So they're going to see you as part of the government entity that's causing them these problems, unless you're actually really proactive about saying, hey, we're not going to have any information for a while, but we're here to answer any other questions that you might have about the process.
Yeah.
Who will have it next, all of that good stuff, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of times people come to you because they're grieving or because they're traumatized and they really just need somebody to listen to them. And they're not going to get that from the police department necessarily. They're not going to get that from the city attorney's office necessarily, right?
Mhm.
There might be things that you can actually refer them to. Like we have a victims advocate, office here, right? There's places where you can send people to. As a matter of fact, we had so many referrals. We had, before we was, all digital and we went to a 311 information system within the city, we had binders and we'd be like, okay, so this person should probably go talk to this person. And, we were like connectors for all of those people because they really were navigating in waters that they weren't used to and weren't comfortable in. Sorry about the dog, guys, and the kids in the background.
We all have them.
Well, Gia brings up a good point, because there's no staff, and you got, I am certain that you are all contacted individually by people as you're in the community. Like, hey, I mean, they want to talk to you about some issue or about their complaint. Having a database of that type of information that's available to all of you so that you're all giving out kind of the same information would probably be really helpful. That consistency, I think, would also be probably comforting to the community, because they're getting the same information from everyone. Everybody, no matter who they talk to, they're going to get the same.
When you say that, Cami, you're referring to, let's say there's a complaint and a person is contacting us, that we're all on the same page, that we know where we are in the process. So is that what you're referring to, questions about a particular incident or complaint?
Yeah, well, I'm talking about that. And I'm also talking about that if there is, if this is someone who has lost a loved one, or they are experiencing trauma because of the encounter that they had, that all of you have who you could put them in contact with. Not everybody knows who those victims group advocacy groups are. And so also kind of having a database for that, I think, would be helpful. Because normally you would have a staff person that you would have contact them and give that information to. But until that time comes, you guys all having kind of a quick reference guide might be helpful.
You guys, I have gone to some serious extremes trying to help some of the family members that we work with, to the point where I was actually referring her out to counseling services and getting the city attorney's office to pay for them, right? There's gonna be a whole level of where you decide you actually fit into that. But when you're a community resource, especially around these really serious issues, You know, it's worth it to try and build that, or to figure out who in the city you can refer people out to that are going to be empathetic, going to understand the trauma and the grief, and, you know, going to be able to help them instead of you.
I thought I would just maybe summarize something that is a conversation we've been having for all the commissioners that are here, and maybe see if there's any follow-up. So we've only recently, as Shireen indicated, started reaching out to complainants when they file a complaint. Before that, it just went to the police department and whatever happened. And we were wondering about what are the contours of what should the contours of our interaction with complainants be? So I think Shireen mentioned, you know, we've now reached out and, you know, let them know we've received the complaint, and that if they have any questions or would like updates of where we are in the process, that we'd be happy to talk to them and encourage them to reach out to us. So I guess it probably is common sense, but I just am wondering if you have any other guidance around the conversation. So for example, you know, if a complainant does start sharing their story with you and so forth, is that okay for us to listen to? Any advice around that kind of thing?
You know, that's so difficult. So I have been in a situation where I have to actually tell people, look, I'm not professionally trained for this, and I want to be comforting. And a lot of that kind of training can come from trauma-informed practice. And maybe you guys should look into who's actually offering trauma-informed practice training for all of you. But yeah, it's one of those, and the mental health thing. I mean, you would not believe how many people have been, you know, traumatized to the point where you question their mental health when they just say, well, why can't you do something? But why can't you do something? He put his hands on me. Why can't you do something, right? Long after a case has been closed. And, you know, it's not enough just to listen to them. So you really want to actually figure out what your boundaries are. And also, you don't want to do them a disservice, right? You know, you're going to have people that come in that are, you know, don't see or don't hear and, you know, need interpretation, right? Like you just, the whole slew of what you're going to have to actually do should be thought through when you ask for resources, because those resources are really expensive if you can't find them somewhere else in the city or in the police department. And, you know, again, whoever you end up hiring, that first hire should just be a really well-balanced person that can help you with a lot of that stuff. But I would encourage you all to get training so you know where your boundaries are. Those are tough questions. And I didn't feel comfortable many times saying, I wanted to say, hey, stop, let me help you find somebody who's going to actually be able to help you out of this, right? Suicidal people. And, you know, we had a woman walk into our citizen oversight board meeting one time that had just almost gotten killed crossing the street in front of our office by an undercover cop in a chase. And she came in frazzled, like totally blown away by that, because she was coming to see us for something totally different. And it just put a whole nother, you know, layer on stuff that was hard for us to actually, you know, unpack to be able to help her, right? And I'm not suggesting that you guys will necessarily have all of those situations, but you should be prepared to have the traumatic conversations, and also to understand your own boundaries. There's never too much professional training for that stuff. There's just not.
And also, Stephanie, I just wanted to say, in regards to that complainant that may come up and start talking to you about their case, specifics of it, you also have to be very careful, because you will be reviewing that. You don't want to have to exclude yourself for conflict because you've had one side of the story already. And so being able to explain that to the complainant in a way that helps them to understand that you want to be able to review the case, and in an informal manner, you can't hear kind of their version of the events, that goes into the official record. And you just want to make sure that nothing happens to the complaint itself and the investigative process by you hearing information that maybe no one else gets to hear.
And that's why you always hear from these people and they say, we don't comment on ongoing investigations. And it's so frustrating, but you really can't have those conversations during an ongoing investigation. It mars the investigation.
That's really helpful. So a couple of things that I got out of this is, one is that probably we as a commission should work towards developing a list of resources in the community for complaints. And the other is what you said, Gia, about training around boundaries. What kind of training are we talking about? What kind of person would give that?
So it's really interesting. SAMHSA is a mental health organization, a national mental health organization, and provides mental health first aid, which is like a one-day course. It's usually free. You do it with a cohort of 20, 25 people, and you basically get to, you're able to kind of understand your place when somebody is having a mental health crisis or maybe having a mental health crisis, so that you don't, offer suggestions for help. You identify, and then you figure out a resource to send them to, or to give them to, or to call somebody for them, right? And we found that particularly helpful, because the more you understand about what somebody's going through, the more you don't take it personally, and you can actually absorb it without it turning into an event, right? Mm-hmm. And these are constantly heated things between community and police, right? They're super traumatic for a lot of people, and you don't want to be in that situation where you say, well, I would just do this, or maybe you should do that, right? So that's one resource. And then trauma-informed practice is nothing new, and it's all over the place. I would like get involved, look at United Way, look at any kind of public health offerings, either at the city level or at the county level or even at the state level. There should be some kind of programming around those things. Officers generally get both of those. They call it something different. It's called crisis intervention training. But we actually, in our office, we all went through crisis intervention training to understand what the officers were getting. So you might want to do that with the officers.
And then also, just to let you know, on Thursday, the gentleman who'll be doing the training with me is also, he does training on trauma-informed practices, both for policing and trauma-informed civilian oversight. And so he may know people near you that do this, and that have a special understanding of the civilian oversight interaction part of it as well.
Sorry to interrupt. I see Milo's hand raised for a question.
Hi, thank you. I'm not quite sure how to word this. Sometimes we run into, we've discussed before where we've had issues where we ask to see body cam footage and we're denied that option. So we know that there is a complaint, but I guess there's differences in what type of investigation or response would be required. I don't know if you have like any information on that, because you can run into a situation that would be dismissed when in fact it shouldn't be dismissed, without going into specifics. But does my question make any sense?
Yeah, it does. So one of the basics of being able to review and look at do the work that you want to do is that you have the same access to the information that the law enforcement had when they made their case disposition. I mean, otherwise, if you don't have all of that information, you're left with a whole lot of questions, like, were all the witnesses contacted? A lot of those things that Jason talked about last week, were all the witnesses contacted? Were the medical reports, the body cam footage? All of those things are really important in order for you to be able to do your job fairly. If you don't have access to that information, then then it's not oversight. It's just agreement. It's just, passing the paper along to the next person. So now getting access to all of the information, I realize that is, okay, so I've said you need it. It's totally different than them saying, oh, here you go. I think that I sent along an MOU with the New Orleans Police Department and their Office of the Independent Police Monitor. And it's a great roadmap for how an oversight entity and a law enforcement agency can kind of come to an agreement and have a standard practice in place for the transfer and timely transfer of information. So I would look at that to see how they've kind of addressed some of those issues as a roadmap for how you might be able to do the same. But you are not alone in that problem. There are some agencies who just make it very difficult to get access to the information.
Can I ask a quick question of all of you? Can you tell me what your legislative authority is? Is it a ordinance? Is it a charter? What is it?
It's a very vague charter. And yeah, and a lot of the information that we receive, that's granted to us by agreement. So yeah.
Okay. So in Denver, we had to go after two different we got into the charter, and then we had to go after two different kind of clarifying ordinances to, newspapers were getting Freedom of Information Act requests before we were getting requests that were directly to the departments. So we actually went through all of this and actually had to, challenge them on it. That's why it's important to keep your elected officials in the loop on the work that you're doing, and also maybe make a huge deal about what your findings are after this process and what you feel like you need, and make sure that you have community there to support you in what you need when you're done with this.
I just wanted to note that one of our city councilors, Zariah Hightower, is on the call, and just wanted to, if you have any questions or comments, Zariah, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I had a few questions, but I kept losing them as there was just more material and I didn't write them down. So that's on me. I do think like some of the things I feel like are easier than others. Like I feel like just, which I was toying with this idea, which I know the police commissioners know about, because I think maybe it was even our last police commissioner. I was like, how do we continue to have this dialogue that we've had through the joint committee? And maybe I was making it more complicated than it needs to be, and just like once a quarter, there's a standing meeting or standing work meeting between at least the public safety committee and the police commission, which would be an easy kind of fix. And then, so I feel like that's one thing. I think the second thing is, I feel like these trainings are, and I wasn't here for the first two, but I started to watch them remotely, is I have gotten late to the budget, but I've now advocated and am pushing us to add a full-time position for the police commission to do some of this work. Because yeah, it's clear that there's just a lot of kind of administrative work that needs to be done, and just having someone you could delegate that to would be great. So that's not questions, just comments.
Anything else from anyone?
If nobody has any other questions, I think that one of the things that puzzles me the most is I can see the importance of it. I mean, I think it's just been a pretty rough year in Burlington around policing issues. And I think, my question is related to how to develop a relationship with law enforcement officers as compared to the chiefs in a more robust way. And I mean, ride-alongs, I think, is a great way of doing that. I think it feels pretty fraught because they are, I think their morale is quite low because of the criticism they faced, and they may perceive us as part of that problem. And so just maybe any more general advice about how to build a bridge while we at the same time are the oversight body.
I'm happy to speak to that. So you should look into the meetings that the chief and his commanders, or the chief and his captains, have in neighborhoods or outside of the police station, all of ours actually have monthly meetings, and they differ between being in the morning or being in the night. Some are Saturday mornings, but I actually started making the rounds to those and meeting people and meeting the individual officers that were tasked with making presentations at those. The other thing that, you kind of, it's really daunting to think that you're going to go and do a night shift, in a police car, right? But it means so much to them to be able to talk to you about their job and about how they're trained. And, it really was eye-opening for me the first couple of times that I went, and I wasn't even working in oversight. I was working for city council, and, they were doing graffiti stings, right? So they were out doing these graffiti stings, and, just one night, I actually understood a bunch of the barriers that they came up against doing this work, right? And I also got to know a couple of really great cops. Like when they did bust these kids for curfew, like the first thing the cop did was say, call your mom, I want to talk to her, right? Which I thought was great. I mean, it was great practice. He wasn't trying to take him in to, then get picked up downtown and have him go through the process. He was like, if you let him get on the bus, I'm going to make sure he gets on the bus. Will you make sure he gets home, right? And so you actually just kind of get to a point where you can see good action, you can see bad action, and you have a much better understanding of how they're trained and why some of that is problematic, as well as why some of it is not known to people. I mean, I remember the first time that, we were with a group of kids and the cop said, if you ever walk up to me on the side where I carry my arm, you're going to get a different reaction from me is if you come up to the other side. And I never thought about that. I could walk up to cops in the mall and say, hey, do you know where this is, right? Never even think about how I walked up to them. But just that one bit of information while we were doing a Know Your Rights training was incredibly helpful for the time that I spent with kids after that. It's a really easy thing to make sure that nothing escalates. It's like, walk around the cop. Please walk around the cop, and then you can talk, right? And it may seem like that's their problem, and that's good and fine, but it doesn't help to get people talking to each other, and it doesn't help not to know how they're trained to actually be protective.
Great.
And this is just a very small way that some oversight agencies are also just trying to kind of in the background work on those relationships. And that's by promoting the fact that they accept not only complaints, but commendations that I mentioned in the reports. Make sure that those commendations are part of your report so that it's not all the bad, that it also is highlighting the good that does happen. So making sure that that's part of that is also, and also there are oversight entities who, and I don't think this is outlined in your authorities, but making an accessible process for law enforcement to file complaints against fellow law enforcement officers is also is a way to kind of build goodwill, because there are officers who have those complaints that do not feel comfortable going internally to make them, regardless of any whistleblower law that might exist. They just don't. And so making a process that's confidential and accessible to them for that as well is also something that you can add to the list of things.
And sometimes those come in as anonymous complaints that seem like they're not resolvable, but they give you tons of information. It's another reason why you should take anonymous complaints, even though they're not ideal.
So could I ask about that? So in our current complaint process, people can file online or various ways. And Jabu can correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that the complaint goes to the chair of the commission and to the chief. And so in these complaints from police officers, are you suggesting that that would be a process whereby those complaints could directly come to us as a commission, like not to the chief?
So in some manner, at least you know about it, so he can't push it under the rug
I see.
and say it can't be investigated. But then beyond that, I imagine that you guys would like to actually have the authority and the ability to actually, you know, make sure that he's engaging in the investigation, regardless if there's a complaint or not a complaint. I can tell you stories, but I've done a lot of that, and you know, there's just like things come around. I was taking an Uber one time, and this woman started telling me this long story about this police officer. And then I said, I want to stop you because I actually, you know, work in an office that oversees the police. And by the end, she had license plate numbers and badge numbers and everything else. And, you know, like, what do you do when you're actually faced with that? So I got to the office and we discussed it. And I actually called Internal Affairs and I said, I think this was a complaint that was filed with me this morning, right? And I have stuff to give you, and I, you know, want to make sure that you get to it. So things are going to be, until you figure out how those things work through your agreements and through ordinances and stuff, you're just going to have to keep insisting that, you know, that everything's looked at in a thorough and unbiased manner, right? And that includes anonymous complaints. And also there will be complaints that come in as service complaints. And you should ask to be part of any complaints that come to them should also be sent to you. Because I know that a lot of agencies have it one direction, but not all agencies have it the other direction. So for agencies like, well, I don't need to name them, but for Cammy's.
Can you explain service complaints just so everyone knows what those are?
Absolutely. So those are generated inside the department. They can be generated by a supervisor. They can be generated by a coworker. Those can be anonymous too. There are complaints that actually just are internal and don't involve civilians, don't involve the public. And some people, I think we at least distinguish between the two. And when people would call us and say, you know, there was a cop parked on the median, you know, giving tickets, and it, you know, you couldn't make a left turn there safely with him parked there. So that would come into our office, and we would actually suggest that a service complaint was opened about it, right? Because we got the information, but the person didn't want to stick around to actually see the officer get dinged, but, you know, wanted him to think about, you know, being parked backwards on a median, right? And so those are service complaints. And then there's something else, and I just totally lost it. That's
So
okay.
I'm not sure I'm clear on what a service complaint is.
They're generated internally. They're not necessarily, it's not a complaint that actually wants to see resolution, or it's not personal to them that there's resolution. Does that make sense?
I'll jump in here. Let's say, yeah, sorry, I thought I was muted. Let's say a lieutenant's reviewing something and they see something in the BWC that they are like, this doesn't look right. And then they start a complaint. Then they start the process of investigating that. That'd be an internally generated complaint. At least how we do, at least in BPD. And Shireen can correct me if I think that's. Yeah.
So did we answer your question, Stephanie?
No, I got it now. That was helpful. Thanks.
Once we actually were very much established and had programming that was going on in the community that involved some officers, and, you know, we were doing stuff, we had officers that came to us and said, you know, we're experiencing discrimination in the department and would like to sit down with you. I mean, they got to a point where they actually trusted that we were fair and impartial and that we were going to actually do the right thing, right? And so once you get to a place where you're part of the system, you know, that respect should exist, and you know, that kind of communication and interaction should also exist. You know,
And it's important.
You're not there to tear up the department or to fire anybody. You're there to make sure that everybody has representation, right?
Right, and it's really important to note that that is not a fast process, building that trust and legitimacy. And so I'm going to say that word again, expectations. You know, everybody wants that to happen very quickly. Once, you know, effective practices are put into place, and it takes time. because you're talking about a whole lot of trust that needs to be built, where in many cases it doesn't exist at the moment. And so trying on either side. And so trying to build that trust is going to take time, but still continuing to kind of go at it will eventually get you to the point where people see you as this fair, impartial entity that is going to give everybody a fair shot at true accountability and a just process. So
that was a relief to hear that, that it takes time, because I was just like, how are we going to get from here to there? So, okay, that's really helpful.
Right. Well, and you're laying the groundwork for the people who are going to come after you as well. Like, I think most people who are on boards and commissions, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's an oversight or elsewhere, they want to get everything done in their term and make sure, but everything that's worthwhile takes time, unfortunately. Real change, and not just change on the surface, takes time. So,
and there's also, you know, you have to take into consideration that while you're just Burlington, you're actually affected by, you know, national trends and patterns around policing, right? Like there was this time during the Obama administration where, you know, they were releasing reports and, you know, doing hearings and doing all this really proactive work around bringing policing up to a level of, you know, community accountability that, you know, I mean, they said that everybody should have some form of oversight, but realistically, they expected police departments to actually train themselves and train all of their officers with community in mind, the communities that they serve, the communities that they're actually paid by, right? The communities that they're part of. And that hadn't happened, I don't know, ever that I remember. That hadn't happened until then. And the last 5 years have been a drag since that went away. I mean, it's the, you know, national conversations about policing have only really turned around in the last 15 months, and we all know why, right? It's just really important that we're all working together and that we're all figuring out good responses to, you know, it's a community crisis if you've got policing problems in your communities, especially in your low-income Black and brown neighborhoods.
Any further questions out there for our wonderful panelists that are helping us with this?
I can't get over how timely this stuff is. I mean, we've just been talking about our annual reporting out. It's uncanny how you've touched upon all these things that we're talking about and struggling with. And so this has been so helpful once again.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Tammy is always on point like that.
Yeah,
I also just want to do a plug for our annual conference because it's going to open for registration soon. And I would very much encourage all of you to take advantage of all of these incredible sessions that we're going to be having. It's the virtual conference. It's going to run from mid-August through the beginning of October. And there's something like 32 sessions in that. And then there's an in-person in Tucson in December with very limited space, but still going to be very, you know, in-depth for organizations that are really trying to do, you know, some good work. So consider looking at our website and signing up for some of that stuff. The virtual ones, you actually get, you basically buy the library. So you don't have to be, you know, there for every one of the
We don't expect you to sit through 32 sessions consecutively every day for 6 weeks. I am the only one that has to do that.
Will you, sorry.
Yeah, no. I was just going to say, but really look into that because we're the only ones that we all have, right? Like this last year has killed all of us that are practitioners because we haven't been able to get in the same room to talk about new stuff and old stuff. You know, we hold these kind of our own community forums and we can't even believe how many people sign up for them and just want to talk to somebody else that's doing the work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. There's trauma-informed practices for civilian oversight practitioners as well.
Yeah.
So.
Cami, given that we now have a NACOLE membership, will we be getting an email that announces the conference and stuff just automatically?
Yes. So I will make sure that all of the email addresses have been uploaded into our database so that all of you get it. And that actually is our announcement's I've said this for 3 days in a row now. It'll be out tomorrow. I also, when on my list, those webinars, when I send you those links, there's also an entire page of past webinars that might be of benefit. I have to tell you, I can't remember if we talked about this in the last session. Maybe I sent you I think I did send it, the role of the supervisor in facilitating change in law enforcement. And so I hope you all have a chance, if you haven't already, to watch that. I think beyond it just being great information, it just was so eye-opening to look at something in a different way. I had not thought about the importance of looking at that kind of supervisor level within the law enforcement as a really good opportunity to implement great change, or the ability for change to go nowhere if they're not on board. Definitely take a look and see if there are any other ones in there that might be helpful to you.
Great. If nobody else has anything, I'll just pop out another question, and that is, I was sort of intrigued about the comment that we should have a social media presence, and that feels kind of dicey to me, because as you said, we shouldn't be talking about details. So, I mean, for example, I could imagine if we had a social media presence now, we could have sent out a Facebook thing, and I totally agree about Twitter. We could have put on Facebook that there were going to be these NACOLE trainings that the community could participate in. But I wonder if you have any other guidance around what kind of things are effective in terms of social media, and what kind of things should we stay away from?
I do. So social media is actually super powerful in terms of educating people. Most people get half of their news at least off of social media, right? So, every morning when I'm actually doing all of my scanning of kind of my own world and looking at Facebook and looking at all my emails, I actually pull stuff down for 2 agencies that I'm working with. And I only post the article, and I pull an excerpt out of the article to just give them a taste, right? And so that's perfectly safe. You just don't want to actually really do a lot of media around your police department and your work. You want to actually try and do an educational thing from other places, because it's not personal and it doesn't bring up questions about where you stand on stuff. You don't want to opinionize. You want to actually pull a piece out that gives people a taste of what the story is about. So that's one. I really am not. We do lots of pictures. We do pictures from our meetings, right? Figuring out who might want to cover one of your reports or something that you're working on with policy or anything like that is always a reason to reach out to local media. You don't always have to do that through a press release. A press release is pretty formal, but once you actually get to know the players or already know the players, and you can actually say, hey, we're going to have a piece coming out in about a month. I'd like to give it to you, embargoed for 2 days before, so that you can get to know the piece before we actually release it. And, we'd love to have you cover it. And they'll say, yes, that would be great. I'd love to actually understand that. Or they'll say, yeah, I'm not interested. Once it's out, I'll take a look, right? But you haven't lost anything, right? Except a much larger audience for that one particular thing. But yeah, start collecting them. I have press releases in the 2 offices that I'm helping with right now. So yeah, anytime you see anything that's covering police or any kind of public safety issues, you want to pull that reporter down and put it into your database.
So do you have, when you say you kind of, cite some articles you've been reading and so forth, do you have a Facebook page or something that you could direct me to?
So I'm going to direct you better than that. NACOLE actually has an RSS feed, and Cammie could take your email right now probably and throw it into that Google RSS feed. So every couple of days, 5 or 6 articles will come out that members actually post for everybody else to see. And I take a lot of them from there, actually.
Yeah, it's essentially a listserv. And there, not only do our articles posted, but people who have questions about, they're struggling with something in their own community, like, who has access to X, Y, and Z, and do you have sample policies surrounding that? And then people can then direct message them and give them that information. And occasionally it gets a little heated in there, but for the most part, it's pretty benign. It's no Twitter feed for sure. But it is really helpful. And it's one more way to network within the oversight community as well.
Great.
The other thing that you can do with your social media is actually do kind of bios on each of you at different times, short bios and a picture, let them get to know you and how to get in touch with you. That's always really helpful for community to actually feel like, that there's somebody out there looking at the police, good and bad. It's important for them to have access to you. There was a time, Denver had something like 80 different locations where we dropped off brochures every single year. We checked where those brochures were located. We refilled the things. It's just, that's not possible anymore in this world, right? Like most people don't get that. And they use, they use those flyers, they use the complaint forms as, paper airplanes. And so, yeah, you just want to get out there in as many places as you can digitally so that, so you're not out hustling 80 locations across Burlington.
Well, it's hit 8:01, and do we have any further questions?
Can I just add, just to kind of get you prepared for Thursday, one of the things that we're going to be talking about are challenges and opportunities, and it will be an interactive discussion. And so just to kind of get you thinking about some of the things that have been on your minds. I know we've been talking about them throughout. You all are fantastic in that you have been participating throughout, but we're going to be able to talk about that a little bit more, talk about some solutions to some of those issues if we haven't addressed them already. And so just wanted to get you thinking in advance.
Thank you. Awesome. I think with that then, I've already said it last two meetings, but thank you so much for this. Like, this is honestly invaluable. These training sessions and this help that we've been getting for this, and very much looking forward to seeing you guys at 5:30 p.m. on Thursday.
Great.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you all
you,
so much.
everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for your time. Great being with all of you.
You too. Thanks so much, Gia.
Thanks, everyone.
So,
Bye-bye.
thank you. And with that, I believe we can, well, we already lost the quorum, so meeting is officially over. Everyone have a great night, and we'll see you on Thursday.
All right, take care.